They told the entire town never to open the veteran's cave. But the day his German shepherd uncovered a buried chain in the dirt, a secret hidden for 50 years began to wake up. High in the quiet mountains of Silver Ridge Valley, Ethan Walker returned from war carrying memories he could never fully escape. The only companion who understood his silence was Ranger, a retired military German shepherd who had already saved his life once before. But neither of them expected that a rusted chain behind an old cabin would lead them to a mystery the whole town had feared for half a century. Before the mountain revealed its truth, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching this story from today? There was a chain on the cave, and there was a chain on me. The one on the cave had been there longer than anyone in Silver Ridge Valley could remember. Rust had eaten its color until it looked like dried blood across the wooden door set into the mountainside. The chain was thick, heavy, wrapped twice through iron rings hammered deep into the stone. An old padlock hung from it like a warning. The door stood halfway up a steep slope behind a weather-beaten cabin that leaned against the wind like a tired man. Pine trees surrounded the place in every direction, their branches whispering against each other in the cold Colorado air. The Rocky Mountains stretched beyond them, jagged and endless, their peaks glowing pale blue beneath a sky that always felt bigger than a person had any right to stand under. I had been staring at that door for nearly an hour. Beside me sat Ranger. He was a German shepherd, tall and broad-shouldered, his fur the color of dark honey and charcoal. The army had trained him for patrol work overseas. Explosives, tracking, search and rescue, things most people preferred not to think about. Now he belonged to me, or maybe I belonged to him. Ranger sat quietly, ears alert, golden eyes fixed on the cave door, as if it were speaking a language only he understood. The wind pushed down the mountainside and rattled the chain with a faint metallic sound. Clink. That sound made my shoulders tighten. Some sounds never really leave you. A chain moving in the wind could become the clatter of gear in a Humvee. A slammed door could turn into a rifle crack echoing through an alley halfway around the world. I rubbed the heel of my hand against my eyes. Sleep had been scarce since I got back from Afghanistan 3 months ago. Nights were the worst. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same moment again. The dust rising, the shout over the radio, the sudden thunder of gunfire. Sometimes I woke up on the cabin floor before I even remembered falling asleep. Ranger had learned the pattern. Whenever the nightmares came, he nudged me awake with his nose and stayed close until the shaking stopped. He had done the same thing over there in the desert. Some habits survive the war. I looked at the chain again. The whole valley knew about it. The cave had been sealed more than 50 years ago by my grandfather, Harold Walker. In Silver Ridge Valley, people still spoke his name the way you talk about weather. Something powerful that had once passed through and left the landscape changed. Some said he had been a genius. Others said he had been crazy. Most just said he had been stubborn. Before he died, he had gathered nearly the entire town outside the small courthouse down in Ridge Hollow. That was the story everyone told. Farmers, miners, shop owners, even the preacher had stood there while Harold Walker pointed up toward the mountains and made them swear something. No one was ever supposed to open that cave. Not now, not later, not ever. According to the old-timers, his exact words had been simple. "That cave stays closed until the right man stands in front of it." Then he had gone home. 3 days later, he died. And somehow, the valley had kept the promise. People avoided the place after that. Hunters stayed clear of the slope behind the cabin. Kids dared each other to walk near it, but never touched the chain. Some said the cave held poison gas. Some said it held buried uranium from the old mining days. Others said something worse. The rumors had grown thick over the decades, twisting through the valley like fog. But the truth was simpler. Nobody really knew. Ranger stood slowly, his nose lifted toward the cave door. The fur along his spine rose slightly, the way it did when he caught a scent he didn't like. "You smell something?" I asked quietly. His ears twitched. He stepped closer to the door. I followed. The slope crunched under my boots as loose gravel shifted down toward the trees below. The cabin sat about 50 yards behind us, its porch half buried under old snowdrifts that had frozen and thawed a dozen times through the winter. This place had belonged to my grandfather. Now it belonged to me. Or at least that's what the lawyer in Denver had said when he called 2 weeks ago. The inheritance had been simple. The cabin, 10 acres of forest, and the cave. No money, no bank account, no explanation. Just land and a locked door. I crouched beside Ranger. He was sniffing the base of the chain where it met the rock. His tail moved once, slow, uncertain. "What is it, boy?" The wind shifted again. For a moment, the air carried the deep mineral smell of the mountain itself. Cold stone, damp earth, and something older. Ranger let out a low sound in his throat. Not quite a growl, more like a warning. I studied the lock. It looked ancient. Rust had swollen the metal until the keyhole was almost gone. No one had touched that thing in decades. My grandfather had sealed it himself. He had been a geologist before the mining companies left the valley. People said he knew these mountains better than anyone alive back then, which made the whole thing stranger. Why would a man who spent his life studying rock and soil suddenly chain off part of the mountain? Ranger pawed lightly at the ground near the door. Dirt scattered. I frowned. "Hey, easy." He didn't stop. He dug harder, claws scraping against the rocky soil. Then suddenly he froze. His paw touched metal. A dull, scraping sound echoed against the stone wall. I knelt down and brushed aside the loose dirt. Something cold gleamed beneath the surface. Another chain. This one thinner, half buried in the earth. I pulled away more dirt until I could see several links disappearing into the ground. Ranger stepped back. His ears flattened. And for a moment, a strange feeling crept up the back of my neck. The same feeling I used to get before an ambush. That quiet moment when the world seemed to hold its breath. The chain on the door wasn't the only chain here. There had been another one, buried, leading somewhere into the dark behind the wood. The wind rattled the lock again. Clink. Ranger stared at the cave like it was alive. And I realized something I hadn't considered before. Maybe my grandfather hadn't sealed the cave to keep people out. Maybe he sealed it to keep something in. I stood slowly. The mountains around us were silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ranger took one step closer to the door, then another, and the chain hanging there swayed gently against the wood. Clink. For the first time since returning from the war, I felt something other than exhaustion or grief. Curiosity. And in the mountains of Silver Ridge Valley, curiosity had a way of opening doors that had been closed for a very long time. I looked down at Ranger. He looked back at me, like he already knew what we were about to do. But not today. Not yet. Some doors stay closed a little longer, even when the man standing in front of them might be the one they were waiting for. I left the chain alone that afternoon. The wind was getting colder as the sun slid behind the western ridge, turning the mountains purple and gold. Ranger followed me back down the slope toward the cabin, his paws silent against the gravel path that had nearly disappeared under years of pine needles. The cabin didn't look much better up close. It leaned slightly to one side, the wood gray from decades of weather. One of the porch posts had cracked near the base, and someone, probably my grandfather years ago, had wrapped it with an old strip of metal to keep it standing. The windows were dusty. The roof carried patches of snow that hadn't melted all winter. It wasn't much, but it was mine now. Or at least, it was supposed to be. I stepped inside, and the familiar smell of old wood and cold air wrapped around me. The inside of the cabin was small. One main room with a narrow kitchen area and a stone fireplace that hadn't been used in a long time. A faded armchair sat beside the hearth, my grandfather's chair. The same one I remembered from childhood visits that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Back then, the cabin had seemed enormous. The mountains had seemed magical. Harold Walker had been the quiet old man who told strange stories about rocks and rivers and the way mountains moved over thousands of years. Now, the place just felt empty. Ranger walked in behind me and shook the snow from his coat. I dropped my pack beside the table and sat down heavily on the chair across from the window. From there, I could see the slope leading up to the cave. Even from this distance, the chain was visible. A dull line of metal across the dark opening. My chest tightened. The sound came again. Clink. Except this time, it wasn't the chain. It was the memory of another sound entirely. A metal door slamming somewhere far away. My vision narrowed. The cabin walls faded. Dust. Heat. The smell of burning fuel. Someone shouting my name over the radio. My hands gripped the edge of the table. Not here. Not now. Easy, I muttered under my breath. Ranger was already moving. He crossed the room and pushed his head gently against my knee. The pressure was steady, grounding. I inhaled slowly. The cabin returned. The mountains returned. The war drifted back into the part of my mind where it stayed most days, close enough to feel, but far enough not to swallow everything. Ranger sat down beside me and rested his head against my leg. "You always know, don't you?" I said quietly. His ears twitched. He had saved my life once, maybe twice. Over there, in Afghanistan, Ranger had been assigned to our patrol unit after another handler got injured. The Army called dogs like him multi-purpose working dogs, but everyone who worked beside them knew the truth. They were soldiers. Ranger could smell explosives buried beneath sand. He could track a person across rocky terrain hours after they had passed through. Once he had alerted us to a hidden pressure plate just seconds before one of the guys stepped on it. Another time he had dragged a wounded corporal out of a collapsed alley while bullets cracked overhead. He never hesitated. Not once. After the explosion that ended our deployment, Ranger had been injured too, shrapnel tearing through the muscle in his shoulder. He recovered, but the Army decided to retire him. I signed the adoption papers before they even finished explaining the process. Some bonds don't need paperwork. Outside the cabin, the sky darkened. Night came quickly in the mountains. I lit the lantern on the table and opened the envelope that had brought me back here in the first place. The lawyer's letter was folded neatly inside. Mr. Ethan Walker. Following the passing of your grandfather, Harold Walker, ownership of the property located at Silver Ridge Valley has been transferred to you as the sole surviving heir. The words blurred slightly as I read them again. Cabin. 10 acres of forest. mineral rights included, and the cave. The lawyer had mentioned something else during our phone call. Property taxes. Apparently, my grandfather hadn't paid them for several years before he died. The county had allowed the debt to build because the land had little commercial value. But now that ownership had changed, the balance was my problem. The amount circled at the bottom of the letter made my stomach sink. I didn't have that kind of money. Not even close. The VA benefits barely covered groceries and the gas it took to drive into town once a week. Ranger stood up suddenly. His ears pointed toward the door. A vehicle engine rumbled faintly somewhere down the mountain road. Headlights appeared between the trees a moment later, bouncing along the narrow dirt track that led toward the cabin. I frowned. Hardly anyone came up this road. The truck rolled to a stop near the porch. The engine shut off. A tall man stepped out. Even from the window, I could tell he wasn't local. His coat was too clean, his boots too new. He walked toward the cabin with the easy confidence of someone who believed every piece of land in front of him could eventually belong to him. Ranger's growl was low but unmistakable. I opened the door before the man reached the steps. He looked up at me with a practiced smile. "Ethan Walker, I presume." "That's me." He extended a hand. "Douglas Kaine." The name meant nothing to me yet, but Ranger's growl deepened. Kaine glanced at the dog. "Friendly?" "Depends," I said. He laughed softly. "Fair enough." The man looked past me toward the slope behind the cabin, toward the cave. His eyes lingered there longer than they should have. Then he looked back at me. "I hear you recently inherited this property," he said. "Something like that." "Well," Kaine continued, slipping his hands into his coat pockets, "I represent a company interested in acquiring land throughout this valley. Mining prospects, geological surveys, the usual things." The wind moved through the trees behind him. Ranger stepped closer to my side. Kaine's smile remained, but his eyes had sharpened slightly. "I'd like to make you an offer," he said. My gaze drifted briefly up the slope again, to the cave, to the chain. Something about the way Kaine had looked at it made a quiet alarm ring somewhere deep in my mind. The same quiet alarm that had saved my life more than once overseas. I met his eyes again. "What kind of offer?" I asked. Behind me, Ranger's ears were still pointed toward the mountain, and somewhere up there, the chain on the cave door shifted faintly in the wind. Clink. Douglas Kaine turned his head slightly, like he had heard it too. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The mountain behind the cabin loomed dark in the falling dusk, the slope rising through a scatter of tall pines until it disappeared into shadow. Somewhere beyond those trees, the cave door waited, silent again, the chain hanging like a warning left behind by another time. Kaine followed my gaze. "That must be it," he said. His voice carried a casual tone, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "The cave your grandfather sealed up." I didn't answer right away. Ranger stepped forward beside me, his posture stiff. His tail was low, and a quiet rumble built in his chest. Kaine noticed. "Impressive dog," he said lightly. "German Shepherd, right?" "Yeah." "Military?" "Retired." Kaine nodded like that confirmed something he already suspected. "Well," he continued, glancing back toward the mountain again, "your grandfather certainly left behind an interesting piece of land." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope.
I'm prepared to make you a very fair offer for the property. I didn't take the envelope. What kind of mining company buys land with a locked cave nobody's allowed to open? I asked. Kaine smiled again, but this time it felt practiced. Business often requires patience, Mr. Walker.
Land has potential long before it has profit. His eyes flicked briefly toward the slope again, then back to me. The valley is changing, he said. New roads, new investors. A lot of people think there are valuable deposits in these mountains. People? I said. He shrugged. Geologists, surveyors, investors. Ranger growled louder. Kaine's gaze dropped to the dog. Seems like he doesn't care much for me. Ranger usually trusts his instincts. The man studied the dog for another moment, then tucked the envelope back into his coat. Well, he said, I'll give you time to think about it. He stepped backward off the porch. But I wouldn't wait too long. The wind pushed across the valley, rattling the trees. Property taxes on land like this can build up quickly, Kaine added casually. And when the county starts looking for buyers, they don't always wait for the owner to catch up. I felt my jaw tighten. He knew. Of course he knew. He tipped his head once, almost politely. Good evening, Mr. Walker. Then he turned and walked back toward his truck. Ranger stayed rigid until the engine started again. Headlights cut through the dark forest road as Kaine's vehicle rolled away down the mountain. The sound faded slowly. Only the wind remained. Ranger exhaled sharply and looked back up toward the slope. The cave. You don't trust him either, I said quietly. Ranger's ears flicked. The lantern inside the cabin cast warm light across the snow, but the mountain above us stayed dark, and the chain stayed there, waiting. The next morning I drove down into town. Silver Ridge Valley was small enough that most people knew your name before you stepped out of the truck. The road curved through a narrow stretch of forest before opening into a cluster of buildings gathered along a single street. A gas station, a diner, a hardware store. A small courthouse that had probably seen better decades, and a few houses scattered along the edge of the road like they had simply grown out of the land. I parked outside the diner. Ranger jumped down from the passenger seat and trotted beside me as we crossed the gravel lot. Several locals glanced up as we walked in. Some nodded politely. Others stared a little longer. Word traveled fast in towns like this. The returning grandson of Harold Walker had already become a conversation. The smell of coffee and fried bacon filled the air inside. I slid into a booth near the window. Ranger lay down beside my chair. The waitress poured coffee without asking. "You must be Ethan," she said. "Guess that obvious?" She smiled. "This town doesn't get many new faces, especially ones living up on the Walker property." I nodded. "You knew my grandfather?" "Everybody knew Harold Walker," she said. She leaned one hip against the table and lowered her voice slightly. "Not many people understood him, though." I waited. The bell above the door rang as someone else walked in. An older woman wearing a thick wool coat stepped inside and shook the snow off her boots. Her white hair was tied back neatly, and her eyes were sharp in a way that made you feel like she saw more than she said. She spotted me immediately. Then she walked straight over. "You're Harold's grandson." It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." She slid into the seat across from me without asking. "I'm Martha Doyle," she said. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had lived in one place long enough to remember every story it held.
I used to bring your grandfather supplies when the roads were too bad for trucks. I studied her. You knew him well? Well enough to know he wasn't crazy, she said. I blinked. That's not exactly the way people talk about him. That's because people prefer simple stories, Martha replied. She folded her hands on the table.
They say he sealed that cave because something dangerous was inside. She shook her head slowly. Truth is, Harold sealed it because something valuable was. Ranger lifted his head at her voice. Martha glanced down at the dog. Ah, she said softly. So the soldier brought home a soldier. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. Martha looked back at me. Tell me something, Ethan. Her eyes drifted toward the mountains visible through the diner window. Have you opened that cave yet? No. Good. Her answer came quickly. Don't. The word hung between us. Why not? I asked. She leaned closer. Because men like Douglas Kaine have been waiting for that door to open for a very long time. My stomach tightened. You know him? I know his family, she said. They've been sniffing around those mountains since before you were born. Her gaze hardened. And if Kaine offered to buy your land, it means he believes your grandfather was right about something. I felt Ranger shift beside me. Outside the diner window, the mountains rose quietly above the valley. Martha followed my gaze. Then she said something that made the air in the room feel suddenly colder. Harold Walker spent 20 years studying the rock in that cave. She paused. And whatever he found in there was important enough to make him chain the mountain shut. The wind rattled the diner window softly. Far above the town, the slope behind my cabin sat hidden beneath the trees. And somewhere up there, a rusted chain still guarded a door no one in Silver Ridge Valley had dared open for half a century. The mountains looked calm from the diner window. Too calm. The kind of quiet that made a man wonder what it was hiding. I finished my coffee slowly while Martha Doyle watched me with patient eyes. Outside, the morning clouds were drifting low across the Rocky Mountains, brushing against the dark pine ridges like smoke. You thinking about the cave? She asked. I suppose everyone in this town thinks about it. Martha gave a soft snort. No, she said. Most people in this town avoid thinking about it. She leaned back in the booth. But men like Douglas Kaine don't. Ranger rested his chin on my boot under the table. His breathing was slow and steady, but every now and then his ears twitched toward the door, as if he expected trouble to walk in at any moment. You said Kaine's family has been watching that mountain for years, I said. That's right. Why? Martha studied me carefully before answering. Because Harold Walker spent most of his life studying the rock formations in that cave, she said. And people with money always believe rocks hide something worth taking. What kind of something? She shook her head. Your grandfather never told anyone the full story. The waitress came by with a fresh pot of coffee, but Martha waved it away. He told me once that some discoveries shouldn't belong to companies, she added quietly. He said the mountain would decide when the truth came out. I frowned. That sounds like something an old man says when he wants to avoid answering questions. Martha smiled faintly. Harold Walker was a lot of things, Ethan. She pointed toward the mountains. But he was never foolish. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, sending a swirl of dry snow across the street.
Martha stood slowly from the booth. "You take care of that dog," she said. Ranger lifted his head. "He looks like the kind that knows more than he says." "He probably does," I replied. She paused before leaving. "And Ethan," she said, her voice lowering again, "if that cave ever opens," her eyes held mine, "make sure you're the one who opens it." Then she walked out into the cold morning. The drive back up the mountain felt longer. The road climbed through narrow turns between thick stands of pine and spruce. Snow lay in patches along the ground where the sunlight couldn't reach.
Ranger stood with his front paws on the center console, watching the trees as they passed. By the time we reached the cabin, the clouds had thickened overhead. The air carried that sharp mountain smell that comes right before another storm. I stepped out of the truck and looked up the slope again. The cave was hidden behind a line of trees from here, but I could still picture the rusted chain stretched across the opening. Martha's words echoed in my head. "Make sure you're the one who opens it." Ranger jumped down and immediately started up the path toward the mountain. "Hey," I called. He didn't stop. His tail was straight, his ears forward. That was Ranger's mission mode. I grabbed my jacket and followed him. The trail behind the cabin wasn't much more than a narrow track winding uphill through fallen needles and rocks. My grandfather must have walked it thousands of times during his life. The climb took about 10 minutes. The trees thinned near the top, and then the cave appeared again. A dark opening in the stone wall of the mountain. The chain still stretched across the entrance, its rusted links hanging heavy between two iron bolts hammered deep into the rock. Ranger stopped several yards away. His nose was pressed low to the ground. "What is it?" I asked. He began pawing at the earth. At first, I thought he was chasing some scent buried under the leaves. But then the sound changed. Scrape. Metal. I crouched beside him. Ranger kept digging with determined movements, pushing aside pine needles and loose dirt until something dull and gray began to appear beneath the surface. A chain. Not the one across the cave door. Another one, half buried in the ground. What the? I brushed away more dirt with my hands. The chain was thicker than the one on the cave entrance. Several links were twisted slightly, like they had once been pulled under enormous tension. It disappeared into the soil on one side and vanished beneath a flat stone on the other. Ranger stepped back, watching me. The moment my fingers touched the cold metal, something deep in my chest tightened. It was the same feeling I had felt in Afghanistan just seconds before an ambush. That quiet instinct soldiers learn to trust, the sense that something about the world in front of you is wrong, very wrong. I stood slowly. The wind moved through the trees. Ranger shifted closer to me. Then he did something he had only done a few times before. He stepped directly in front of me, blocking my path toward the cave. His posture was rigid, protective. "Ranger?" The dog's eyes were fixed on the dark opening in the rock, not barking, not growling, just watching, waiting. The cave remained silent, but the darkness inside it seemed deeper now, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. I looked back down at the buried chain. Whatever it had once held, it had been strong enough to drag iron across stone. And suddenly the question that had haunted Silver Ridge Valley for 50 years felt heavier than ever. What had my grandfather locked inside that mountain? And why had he needed 2 chains to keep it there? The wind slipped through the trees and carried the smell of cold stone down the slope. I stood there longer than I should have. Ranger still blocked the cave entrance, his body angled slightly toward me like a shield. The buried chain lay exposed beneath the thin layer of pine needles, dull metal catching the gray afternoon light. Whatever had happened here hadn't been part of a ghost story. It had been work. Heavy work. The kind of work a man did when he was trying to hold something back. I crouched again and brushed the rest of the dirt away from the chain. It continued several feet before disappearing beneath a slab of rock that looked deliberately placed. My grandfather hadn't just locked the cave, he had built something around it. "All right," I muttered to myself. "That's enough for one day." Ranger glanced back at me. His ears relaxed a little when I stepped away from the cave entrance. We walked down the slope together. But the feeling followed me. That same quiet warning that had lived in the back of my mind since the war. Something wasn't right about this mountain. The truck was still cold when I climbed in. Clouds had rolled in thicker now, turning the sky the color of steel. Snow threatened to fall again. Ranger settled into the passenger seat while I started the engine. Neither of us noticed the second truck until it pulled around the curve and stopped at the base of the driveway. Black. Polished. Too expensive for a place like Silver Ridge Valley. Douglas Kaine stepped out again. He removed his gloves slowly, studying the cabin and the slope behind it with that same calculating look. Ranger stiffened instantly. His low growl filled the cab. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I had a feeling." I stepped out of the truck. Kaine gave a polite nod. "Mr. Walker." "You get lost on the road yesterday?" "Not at all," he said. "I simply thought you might appreciate having a little more information before deciding about my offer." He walked a few steps closer. Snow crunched beneath his boots. "You see," Kaine continued, "land ownership in mountain counties can become complicated." "That's a nice way of saying expensive." He smiled slightly. "Exactly." He reached into his coat and produced a thin folder. Inside were several documents. He handed them to me. "Property tax statements," he said. The numbers printed on the pages made my chest tighten. The debt was larger than I thought. Years larger. "You've got about 60 days before the county opens the land for outside buyers," Kaine explained calmly. "After that, you won't have much say in who ends up owning the mountain." I closed the folder slowly. "And you just happened to drive up here out of kindness?" Kaine laughed. "I'm a businessman, Mr. Walker, not a charity." He gestured casually toward the mountains. "My company believes this valley contains significant mineral potential." Ranger barked suddenly. Sharp. Warning. Kaine's eyes flicked toward the slope behind the cabin, toward the cave. Then he looked back at me. "You see," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "we believe the deposits may actually run through your property." "Interesting," I replied. "What makes you think that?" Kaine studied me carefully. "Your grandfather spent 20 years studying rock formations inside that cave." The words landed heavily. "You've been doing your homework." "I always do." Ranger stepped out of the truck and moved beside me. His fur bristled. Kaine noticed. "That dog doesn't like me very much," he said. Ranger tends to notice things before I do. The businessman's smile tightened a little. "Well," he said, "I'll make things simple." He pulled out another document. "This is a purchase offer for the entire property." I glanced down at the number printed on the page. It was more money than I had seen in years, enough to pay off the tax debt, enough to leave Silver Ridge Valley and never look back. "You'd be free of the land," Kaine said smoothly. "Free of the debt." The wind picked up again. Somewhere high on the mountain, the trees creaked softly. "Why the rush?" I asked. Kaine's expression didn't change. "Opportunity doesn't wait forever." Ranger growled again, louder this time. Kaine looked down at him. For a moment, something flashed behind his polite expression. Something colder. "I'd be careful letting that animal run loose," he said quietly. "Mountain roads can be dangerous." The threat was subtle, but it was there. My hands tightened around the papers. "You done talking?" I asked. Kaine slid his gloves back on slowly. "For now." He stepped toward his truck again, but before opening the door, he paused. "One last thing, Mr. Walker." He nodded toward the mountain. "Whatever your grandfather was hiding up there, I promise you it's worth more than you think." Then he climbed into the truck. The engine roared to life. Snow began to fall lightly as the vehicle disappeared down the road. Silence returned. Ranger stood beside me, staring down the empty driveway. The papers in my hand rustled in the wind. I looked up toward the slope again, toward the cave, and the chain. Kaine wanted that mountain badly, too badly, which meant Martha Doyle had probably been right. Whatever my grandfather had locked away up there, it wasn't just a cave. And if Kaine believed it was worth taking, then there was only one way to find out the truth. The chain would have to come off. The decision settled inside me like cold iron. I stood in the yard long after Kaine's truck disappeared down the mountain road. Snow drifted slowly from the sky, settling on the pine branches and the roof of the old cabin. Ranger stayed close. He didn't bark. He didn't move away. He simply watched the slope above us, as if he already knew what I was about to do. I went inside the cabin and lit the lantern again. The room glowed with soft yellow light, shadows stretching across the wooden walls that had seen more winters than I could count. My grandfather's tools were still hanging on the far wall. Old mining picks, a rusted shovel, and a heavy iron hammer. The handle was worn smooth from decades of use. I lifted it slowly. For a moment, I imagined Harold Walker standing in this same room, holding the same hammer, deciding whether to seal the cave forever. "What were you protecting?" I muttered. Ranger's nails clicked softly on the floor as he followed me back outside. The snow had stopped, but the sky had grown darker. Storm clouds rolled across the peaks like waves of gray stone. A mountain storm was coming. Perfect timing. I started up the slope. The trail felt steeper this time, not because the mountain had changed, because the decision had. Every step brought me closer to the cave, closer to whatever my grandfather had hidden inside the mountain for half a century. Ranger walked a few feet ahead, his ears sharp and his movements quiet. Halfway up the trail, the wind picked up again. The trees groaned softly. By the time we reached the clearing, the air had turned cold enough to sting my lungs. The cave waited exactly where it always had. Dark, silent. The rusted chain stretched across the opening like a final warning. I stepped closer. The iron links were thicker than they looked from below. Rust flaked away beneath my fingers as I touched them. Someone had meant for this chain to last. Ranger stood just behind my shoulder. His breathing was slow but alert. "Easy, boy," I murmured. The hammer felt heavy in my hands. For a moment I hesitated. My grandfather had asked the entire town never to break this chain. He had made them promise. And now I was standing here with a hammer ready to do exactly that. The wind blew down from the ridge, pushing cold air out of the cave opening. It carried the faint smell of stone and something older. Not dangerous, just deep, like the breath of the mountain itself. "All right," I said quietly. I raised the hammer. The first strike echoed sharply against the rock wall. Clang! The sound rolled down the slope and disappeared into the forest below. Ranger flinched slightly but stayed beside me. The lock held. I swung again. Clang! Rust cracked along the edge of the metal. The third blow came harder. Clang! This time the old iron lock split down the middle. The chain jerked loose with a metallic rattle. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the broken lock fell. The chain sagged, and the cave opened. The wind that rushed out felt colder than the air outside. It carried the damp scent of underground stone, minerals, and years of sealed silence. I lowered the hammer slowly. Ranger stepped forward first, his nose lifted toward the darkness. Then he walked inside. I followed. The beam of my flashlight cut through the black interior, revealing rough stone walls that curved inward like the inside of a giant throat. The floor sloped gently downward. The cave wasn't natural in the way I expected. Someone had widened the entrance long ago. Tool marks carved into the rock. My grandfather's work. The tunnel stretched deeper than the light could reach. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. Ranger moved ahead cautiously, sniffing along the ground. The air inside was cool and still. A few yards in, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber. My flashlight swept across the room, and I stopped breathing. Old equipment rested against the far wall. Wooden crates, metal instruments, a small workbench covered in dust. Maps were pinned to the stone behind it, geological charts. My grandfather had built a laboratory inside the mountain. Ranger padded across the floor and stopped beside a pile of rocks near the wall. He sniffed once, then paused. Useful in art, industry, science. It wasn't just valuable, it was unique. Ranger nudged my arm gently. I looked back into the box. There was one more item. A folded letter sealed in a plastic sleeve. The paper inside had yellowed with age. My grandfather's handwriting covered the front. To Ethan. My heart skipped. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. The first line made the cold air of the cave feel even colder. If you are reading this, it means the chain has finally been broken. Ranger sat beside me quietly. The beam of the flashlight trembled slightly as I continued reading. Harold's message explained everything he had discovered about the mountain, about the mineral, about the people who wanted it. And then the final paragraph stopped me cold. If the cave is open, Harold wrote, you must find the third chamber. I frowned. The third chamber? I lifted the flashlight and shined it deeper into the cave tunnel. The darkness beyond the laboratory chamber stretched further than I had noticed before. Harold's final sentence waited at the bottom of the letter. If you find the third chamber, Ethan, you will finally understand why I had to lock the mountain away. The paper trembled slightly in my hands.
Not because of the cold, because of the weight of those words. For 50 years the cave had been sealed. My grandfather had convinced an entire town to leave it alone. He had chained the entrance, buried another chain in the earth, and walked away from something that, according to the notebooks, could have made him a wealthy man. And yet he hadn't taken it. He had hidden it. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the metal box. Ranger shifted beside me. The beam of my flashlight reflected in his dark eyes. "You hear that?" I whispered. The dog tilted his head slightly. Drip, drip. Water echoed somewhere deeper inside the mountain. The cave wasn't quiet. It was alive in its own slow way. Stone cooling,
Water carving tiny paths through rock. Time itself moving through the mountain, one drop at a time. I stood slowly and looked around the chamber again. The workbench was covered in dust, thick enough to show the marks of my fingers. A few metal instruments rested on the surface, old chisels, a small rock hammer, glass sample jars. Pinned to the stone wall were several maps drawn by hand. They showed the inside of the mountain in careful detail. The first chamber, the tunnel, and farther in, 2 more chambers marked in my grandfather's handwriting. The second chamber was deeper inside the cave. The third was marked with a simple circle and a note beside it. Observation room. I frowned. Observation of what? Ranger moved suddenly, his nose pressed against the floor near the far side of the chamber. He sniffed once, twice. Then he walked slowly toward the dark tunnel that led deeper into the cave. "Hold on," I said quietly. The flashlight beam followed him. The tunnel beyond the chamber narrowed slightly, its ceiling dipping low enough that I had to duck a little to pass through. The stone walls felt colder here, smoother, as if water had been running along them for centuries. My boots crunched softly against gravel. Behind us, the first chamber faded into shadow. The beam of the flashlight stretched ahead, revealing a natural tunnel winding gently downward. Ranger moved carefully, every step deliberate. He paused now and then to sniff the air. It reminded me of the patrols overseas. Ranger walking ahead through narrow alleys or broken streets, reading the world through scents I could never understand. "Easy," I murmured. The tunnel curved once, then again. After about 30 yards, the passage widened suddenly. We stepped into another open space. The second chamber. The ceiling rose higher here, the rock arching upward like the inside of a cathedral carved by nature. Mineral veins ran through the stone walls in pale streaks, silvers, Greens, faint hints of red. My flashlight caught something metallic near the center of the room, a steel tripod. An old surveying instrument sat on top of it. Beside it lay more equipment, boxes of rock samples, glass jars filled with powdery minerals, several lanterns. My grandfather had spent years working here, maybe decades. Ranger circled slowly around the chamber. His nose passed over the ground where old footprints had once pressed into the dust. Harold Walker's footprints. Long gone now. I knelt beside one of the wooden crates and pried open the lid. Inside were small canvas bags tied with twine, each one labeled Silver Ridge Pigment Sample. I untied one of the bags and poured a little of the powder into my palm. The color surprised me. Deep blue, richer than anything I had seen before. When my flashlight hit it, the powder almost seemed to glow. "Is that what you were protecting?" I murmured. The notebooks had mentioned pigment minerals, natural compounds that produced colors stronger than ordinary stone. Painters had once crossed oceans for pigments like this. Industries paid fortunes for stable mineral dyes. Ranger patted over and sniffed the bag in my hand. Then he sneezed. I chuckled quietly. Not impressed, huh? But something about the chamber still felt incomplete. The notebooks had described mineral deposits. The letter had mentioned danger. Yet all I saw here were rocks and tools. Valuable, maybe, but not something worth chaining a cave shut for half a century. I stood again and swept the flashlight beam across the far wall. There, another tunnel. Narrower, barely visible behind a jutting slab of stone. My pulse quickened. That must be it, I whispered. Ranger was already heading toward it. The entrance to the tunnel was low, forcing me to crouch as I stepped inside. The air grew colder again, and the walls closed in around us. For several yards, the passage twisted through the mountain like a natural maze. Then the ground shifted under my boot. Loose gravel slid. I froze. Ranger stopped instantly. The sound echoed faintly ahead. And then, crack! A chunk of stone broke loose from the ceiling. It fell past my shoulder and shattered against the floor. Before I could react, Ranger lunged forward and slammed his body against my leg. The impact knocked me backward just as another rock dropped from above. It smashed into the ground exactly where I had been standing. Dust filled the tunnel. Pebbles rained down. For several seconds, the mountain groaned softly around us. Then the cave went still again. My heart hammered against my ribs. Ranger stood in front of me, breathing hard. His front paw lifted slightly. A small streak of blood showed through the fur. "You all right, buddy?" I whispered. He wagged his tail once. Soldier's answer. Still standing. I reached down and gently checked his paw. Just a scrape. Nothing deep. "You just saved me again," I said quietly. Ranger nudged my arm. The tunnel ahead remained dark, but it was still open. The third chamber waited somewhere beyond it. I lifted the flashlight again, and together we stepped deeper into the mountain. The beam of light trembled slightly as it reached into the narrow passage ahead. Dust still floated in the air from the falling stones, drifting slowly through the cold tunnel like gray fog. The smell of broken rock filled my lungs. Ranger walked carefully now. His injured paw touched the ground with caution, but he refused to slow down. "Easy, boy," I whispered. He flicked one ear back toward me, the way he always did when he heard a command but had already made his own decision. The tunnel twisted once more. Then the walls began to widen. The ceiling lifted higher. The air changed. It felt older somehow, like stepping into a place that had not seen human footsteps for many years. The flashlight beam slid across smooth stone walls, streaked with thin veins of minerals that shimmered faintly in the light. We stepped forward together, and suddenly the tunnel opened. The third chamber. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The cavern was enormous, much larger than the first two chambers. The ceiling rose high above us in a natural dome, its stone surface rippling with layers of mineral deposits formed over thousands of years. But it wasn't the size that made me stop breathing. It was the color. The walls of the chamber shimmered with streaks of pigment stone, reds, blues, greens, and golds that ran through the rock like frozen rivers of paint. The minerals glowed softly under the flashlight beam. Some sections reflected the light so strongly they almost seemed alive. I took another step forward. The floor of the chamber had been cleared long ago. Near the center stood a wooden table, and above it, a lantern hung from a metal hook hammered into the ceiling. My grandfather's lantern. The glass was cloudy with age, but the wick was still inside. He had worked here. Right here. I walked slowly toward the table. Ranger stayed close. The chamber was silent except for the distant dripping of water somewhere far inside the mountain. On the table rested a leather folder. Dust covered its surface. I brushed it away carefully. The leather cracked slightly as I opened it. Inside were several sheets of paper sealed inside plastic sleeves. One of them was another letter. This one addressed not just to me, but to anyone who might one day stand in this room. My grandfather's handwriting was steady. The words filled the page in careful lines. If you are reading this, then the cave has been opened, and you have reached the third chamber. I swallowed and continued. For many years I believed the mineral deposit in this mountain was the most important discovery of my life. The pigments found here are unlike any other natural color on Earth. Their stability could change industries from art restoration to scientific imaging. My eyes drifted toward the glowing veins of color in the rock around me. The letter continued. But that is not the true reason I sealed the cave. A chill ran down my spine. Ranger lifted his head suddenly. The beam of the flashlight flickered across the chamber. I forced myself to keep reading. Several decades ago, representatives from a mining company approached me after learning about my research. They were willing to do anything to gain control of the mountain. The words "anything" were underlined twice. They offered money first. When that failed, they offered threats. The letter paused there. The next line was darker, as if the pen had pressed harder into the paper. That company was operated by the Kaine family. My stomach tightened. Douglas Kaine, the man standing in my driveway. The letter continued. I realized the mountain could never survive industrial mining. The pigments would be stripped away within a few years, leaving nothing but an empty scar where something rare once existed. I looked up again at the glowing walls of the chamber. This place wasn't just a mine. It was something else. Something older. My grandfather's handwriting softened near the bottom of the page. So I created a story. The story of a dangerous cave. A cursed place. A mountain that should never be opened. The people of Silver Ridge Valley believed it, and they kept the promise. But the final paragraph made my pulse quicken again. However, if the cave has opened, then the danger has returned. My eyes moved quickly across the page. The Kaine family will try to take the mountain once they learn the truth. I felt Ranger shift beside me. The dog was staring back toward the tunnel we had come through, listening. The letter ended with a final warning. If they come, you must protect what lies here. Not for me, not for the town, but for the mountain itself. My hands lowered the paper slowly. The chamber felt quieter now, heavier. For decades, my grandfather had protected this place from people like Douglas Kaine. And now that responsibility had somehow landed on me. A retired Marine with too many nightmares and a dog that had already saved his life twice. Ranger suddenly growled, low, sharp. I turned toward the tunnel. At first I heard nothing. Then, a faint sound drifted down from the direction of the cave entrance. Metal. Clinking. The same sound I had heard the first day. Only this time it was different.
Not the wind. Footsteps. Someone else had entered the cave. The sound was faint, but in the stillness of the mountain it carried clearly. Crunch. A small rock shifting beneath a boot. Ranger's growl deepened instantly. Low. Controlled. The kind of warning he used overseas when he sensed danger before anyone else could see it. I turned off the flashlight without thinking. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Only the faint glow of mineral veins remained, reflecting just enough light to outline the cavern walls in ghostly colors. My breathing slowed automatically. Old training returning. In the silence, I listened. Another step echoed through the tunnel. Then a second voice. Muffled. 2 people. Ranger pressed close against my leg. His muscles were tight. Ready. I crouched beside the table in the center of the chamber and slid the leather folder and my grandfather's letter inside my jacket. If Kaine had followed me here, the last thing he needed to see was proof that the cave contained something worth fighting for. The footsteps came closer. Flashlight beams flickered faintly along the tunnel walls as they approached. Someone cursed quietly. "Watch your step," a man's voice whispered. Another voice answered. "I told you the chain was broken." Douglas Kaine.
Even in a whisper, I recognized it. My jaw tightened. Of course he had come. Men like Kaine didn't wait long once they believed something valuable was within reach. Ranger's ears twitched. The lights grew brighter as they moved deeper into the cave. I could see the glow creeping down the tunnel toward the 3rd chamber. "Easy," I whispered softly. Ranger understood. He lowered himself to the ground, silent as shadow. The first beam of light slid across the entrance of the chamber. Then Kaine stepped into view. 2 other men followed him. Both carried heavy flashlights and wore thick work jackets. Surveyors or miners. Kaine stopped in the center of the chamber and slowly turned in a circle. The colors in the walls reflected off his face. For a moment, even he looked stunned. "Well," he murmured quietly, "so the old man was telling the truth." One of the other men ran his hand along a streak of bright blue mineral in the rock wall. "Good Lord," he said. "That's pigment stone." "High concentration," the second man added. Kaine smiled slowly. "Enough to make this mountain very valuable." Ranger's growl vibrated faintly in his chest. I kept one hand on his shoulder. Not yet. The men moved farther into the chamber, examining the rock. One of them kicked lightly at the floor. "Looks like Walker had a lab set up in here." "Doesn't matter now," Kaine said. He pulled a small radio from his pocket. "We'll bring the rest of the crew tomorrow." The words echoed in the chamber. Crew. Mining equipment. Explosives, maybe. Within a few weeks, this entire cavern could be torn apart. My grandfather had spent decades protecting it. And Kaine planned to destroy it in days. Ranger shifted beside me. His injured paw scraped lightly against the stone. The sound was small, but in the silent chamber, it carried. Kaine froze. His head turned slowly toward the darkness where we were hiding. "Did you hear that?" one of the men whispered. The second man lifted his flashlight. The beam slid across the cavern floor. Closer. Closer. Then Ranger stepped forward. The growl that rolled out of him this time was not quiet. It was a soldier's warning. Deep, sharp, unmistakable. The men jumped. Kaine's flashlight snapped toward us. The beam struck my face. "Well," Kaine said calmly, "I wondered when you might show up." I stepped out from behind the table. Ranger moved beside me, teeth bared. "You shouldn't be here," I said. Kaine chuckled softly. "I was thinking the same thing about you." The two men behind him shifted uneasily. The chamber suddenly felt much smaller. "Nice little discovery your grandfather left behind," Kaine continued, gesturing to the mineral walls. "Shame he didn't live long enough to profit from it." "This mountain isn't yours," I replied. "Not yet," Kaine said. "But the county will settle that soon enough." His eyes flicked briefly toward Ranger. "Unless, of course, something unfortunate happens first." Ranger stepped forward. His growl filled the cavern again. For a moment, Kaine seemed to consider something. Then he smiled thinly. "Relax," he said. "We're just here to look." But the man beside him shifted his flashlight nervously toward the ceiling. That's when the mountain answered. A deep cracking sound rolled through the chamber. Stone shifted somewhere above us. Small fragments of rock fell from the ceiling. The men froze. Another crack echoed through the tunnel behind them. The narrow passage we had just crossed. "Rock movement," one of the miners whispered. "Everyone back," the other said quickly. The tunnel ceiling groaned again. More stones rained down. Ranger barked sharply. Instinct took over. "Move!" I shouted. The three men scrambled toward the tunnel entrance. But the mountain wasn't finished. With a thunderous crack, a slab of rock broke loose from the tunnel ceiling and slammed into the ground. Dust exploded through the air. The passage filled with falling stone. When the rumbling finally stopped, silence returned. Thick, heavy. The tunnel leading back toward the cave entrance was half buried beneath rubble. One of Kaine's men coughed through the dust. "Tunnel's blocked," he said hoarsely. Kaine stared at the collapsed rock. For the first time since I met him, the confidence in his eyes flickered. The mountain had just trapped us all inside. Ranger stood beside me, alert despite the pain in his paw. The chamber glowed faintly with mineral light, and suddenly the truth of my grandfather's warning felt heavier than ever. This cave wasn't just protecting the mountain. Sometimes, the mountain protected itself. Dust floated slowly through the cavern, drifting through the thin beams of the flashlights like pale smoke. No one spoke at first. The collapsed tunnel behind us filled the chamber with the smell of broken stone and earth. A jagged wall of rock now blocked the passage we had used to reach the third chamber. One of Kaine's men stepped closer to the rubble and shined his light over the pile. "That's a full collapse," he said under his breath. The other man wiped dust from his face. "We're not getting through that without equipment." Douglas Kaine didn't answer. He stood in the middle of the chamber, staring at the glowing mineral veins running through the walls. For a moment, the colors reflected across his face. Deep blues, rust reds, faint streaks of green that shimmered beneath the thin layer of stone. Then his expression hardened again. "Fine," he said calmly. "There's always another way out of a cave." Ranger's growl rumbled softly beside me. I placed my hand gently on his neck. "Easy." The dog stayed alert, his injured paw lifted slightly off the ground. Kaine turned slowly toward me. "Well," he said, "looks like we're all spending the night together." His voice echoed lightly against the cavern ceiling. The two miners exchanged uneasy looks. "This place isn't exactly stable," one of them muttered. "Relax," Kaine replied. "Caves settle after collapses." I didn't answer. Instead, I slowly lifted my flashlight and swept the beam across the chamber walls again. Something caught my eye. High above us. I stepped forward. The beam climbed across the mineral veins that ran through the rock like rivers frozen in time. And then I saw it. Paint. At first, I thought the colors were simply part of the mineral deposit. But as the light moved across the stone, shapes began to appear. Lines, curves, patterns. Not natural. Human. My breath caught. "What is that?" one of the miners whispered. I moved closer to the wall. The flashlight beam widened across the surface of the stone, and suddenly the entire cavern wall came alive. A painting. A massive one. It stretched across the curved ceiling and walls of the chamber. An enormous mural. The image showed the entire Silver Ridge Valley. The mountains, the rivers, the forests, all painted in brilliant natural pigments drawn directly from the minerals inside the cave. The colors were unbelievably vivid. Blues deeper than the sky, greens brighter than summer grass, reds that glowed like fire. Every inch of the valley had been captured in detail. And not just one season, 4. Spring blossoms along the valley floor, summer sunlight reflecting across the river, autumn forests burning gold and orange, winter snow blanketing the mountains. All of it painted across the stone ceiling like the memory of the land itself. "Good Lord," one of the miners breathed. Kaine stared upward in silence. Ranger walked slowly beside me, his head tilted slightly as if even he could sense something special about the place. My grandfather's lantern still hung above the wooden table in the center of the chamber. He must have spent years down here, mixing pigments, grinding minerals, painting the story of the valley across the mountain walls. Not for money. Not for fame. For the mountain itself. "Your grandfather did this?" Kaine asked quietly. I nodded slowly. "He was a geologist," I said. "But he was also an artist." The miner nearest the wall ran his hand gently across the rock. "These pigments, they're stable," he said in amazement. "They could last centuries." Kaine's expression slowly changed again. The awe in his eyes faded. Calculation returned. "Do you have any idea what collectors would pay for this?" he said. The words felt like a slap. "This isn't for collectors," I replied. Kaine looked at me sharply. "Everything has a price, Mr. Walker." The chamber fell silent again. Water dripped faintly somewhere deep in the rock. Ranger stepped between us. His growl returned. Kaine glanced down at the dog. That animal again. But before he could say anything else, the miner near the collapsed tunnel spoke again. "Sir." Kaine turned. "What?" The man pointed his flashlight toward the far side of the chamber. "There's another passage." I followed the beam. Hidden behind a thick column of stone, a narrow tunnel curved upward along the far wall. It hadn't been visible from the main entrance. Natural. Small, but open. My grandfather must have known about it. A secondary exit. Or maybe something more. Kaine smiled slowly. "Well," he said, "looks like we're not trapped after all." He turned toward the passage, but Ranger stepped forward again, blocking the way. The dog's growl echoed off the painted walls. For the first time, Kaine hesitated.
And in the silence of the painted cavern, I finally understood something my grandfather had known all along. The cave wasn't just protecting the mountain. It was protecting the story of the valley itself. A story carved into stone. A story worth fighting for. The chamber felt different now. Not just like a hidden cave, like a cathedral. The painted valley stretched across the ceiling above us,
Seasons flowing into one another in a silent cycle of time. Spring flowers melted into summer sunlight. Autumn forests burned into winter snow. My grandfather had painted the entire life of the valley inside the mountain. And Douglas Kaine was staring at it the way a banker stares at gold. "Remarkable," he murmured. But the word held no respect, only profit. Kaine slowly walked toward the mural, lifting his flashlight to examine the pigments embedded in the rock. "You realize what this means?" he said without turning around. "No," I replied quietly. "I don't think you do." One of the miners shook his head in disbelief. "This isn't just art," the man said. "These mineral pigments, they're stable beyond anything I've seen. If scientists got access to this deposit—" Kaine cut him off. "Scientists don't pay nearly as well as collectors." Ranger stepped forward again. His low growl rolled across the cavern floor. Kaine finally turned back toward me. "Let's stop pretending, Mr. Walker," he said. "You can't protect this place." He gestured toward the mineral walls. "Your grandfather couldn't either." The words echoed through the chamber. I felt my chest tighten. "He protected it for 50 years, I said. Kaine smiled thinly. 50 years of hiding from progress. Behind him, the collapsed tunnel blocked the path we had used to enter. The only visible exit now was the narrow passage on the far wall, the one Ranger was guarding. Kaine noticed that too. He stepped slightly closer. "That dog won't stop me forever," he said. Ranger's teeth showed, a flash of white in the dim light. But Kaine wasn't afraid. Men like him rarely were. Instead, he turned back to the miners. "Start documenting the chamber," he ordered. "Take photos of everything." The two men hesitated. "Sir, this looks like a protected site," one of them said. "Maybe even historic." Kaine's voice hardened. "You work for me," he replied. The miner lowered his eyes and lifted his phone. The small screen glowed in the dim cavern as he began recording the mural. That was when I understood something. The cave itself wasn't the only protection my grandfather had left behind. He had left evidence, proof of what this place really was. Not a mine, a cultural and geological treasure. If the world saw it, Kaine wouldn't be able to tear it apart. But if Kaine got control first... The thought settled heavily in my mind. Ranger shifted beside me. His injured paw trembled slightly now. He had already saved my life once tonight, and now he was standing guard again. Kaine finally noticed the dog's limp. "Well," he said quietly, "looks like the soldier is wounded." Ranger's growl deepened. "Still loyal, though," Kaine added. He stepped forward again. "Tell me something, Ethan." His voice softened. "Do you really think you can stop a mining company with a wounded dog and an old painting on a cave wall?" The question hung in the air. Water dripped somewhere behind us. The miners kept filming, and the mural above us glowed softly in the flashlight beams. I looked up at it again. The painted valley, the mountains, the rivers. My grandfather had left something far more powerful than money. He had left a record, a story, a legacy carved directly into the mountain. I slowly pulled the leather folder from inside my jacket. Kaine's eyes narrowed. "What's that?" "My grandfather's research," I said. The notebook slid into my hand. Geological charts, pigment analysis, detailed records of the mineral formation beneath the valley. Proof of what this place truly was. Kaine's expression darkened. "You should put those away." "I don't think so." I held up the notebook so the miners could see. "Everything in here proves the mountain isn't a mining claim. It's a natural heritage site." The miners exchanged uneasy looks. One of them lowered his phone slightly. Kaine's patience finally snapped. "You think a few pages of notes will stop development? I think the world might want to see what's in this cave." The chamber went silent. Ranger stepped closer to my side. Kaine stared at the notebook. Then slowly he smiled again. But this time the smile was colder. "You're forgetting something," he said. "And what's that?" "We're still inside the mountain." His eyes flicked briefly toward the narrow passage. "Whoever reaches the outside first controls the story." The words settled heavily in the chamber. The miners shifted again. The air felt tighter. Because Kaine was right about one thing. The truth inside this cave only mattered if it reached the world outside. And right now, the only exit from the third chamber was still blocked by one determined German shepherd. Ranger stood there like a silent guard. And for the first time since entering the cave, Douglas Kaine looked uncertain. The silence in the chamber stretched long and heavy. The painted valley above us seemed almost alive in the shifting flashlight beams. Colors moved across the stone ceiling like quiet memories of seasons long gone. Spring green, summer gold, autumn fire, winter white. My grandfather had left the whole story of the land here. Not hidden, preserved. Kaine's eyes moved slowly from the mural to the notebooks in my hand, then to Ranger. The German shepherd stood firm in front of the narrow passage, shoulders squared despite the slight tremble in his injured paw. He wasn't just guarding the exit. He was guarding the truth. One of the miners lowered his phone completely now. "Mr. Kaine," he said quietly. The businessman didn't answer. The miner glanced again at the painted ceiling. "This isn't a mining site." His voice carried a mixture of awe and caution. "It's a cultural landmark." The second miner nodded slowly. "And if those records he's holding prove the mineral formation is unique..." He trailed off. But the meaning was clear. Government agencies, scientists, conservation boards. Once the truth reached them, the mountain would be protected by law. Kaine understood it too. His jaw tightened slightly. "So that's the plan," he said. "You run out of here, wave those notebooks around, and turn this place into some kind of museum." "I plan to protect it," I replied. Kaine laughed softly. "You think the world cares about a cave painting in the middle of nowhere?" I didn't answer. Instead, I looked up at the mural again, at the valley my grandfather had painted. And something inside me finally settled. "I think the world cares about stories," I said quietly. "The kind that remind people what they almost lost." Kaine studied my face for a long moment. Then he looked toward the narrow passage again.
the only open path out of the chamber. Ranger still blocked it, and Kaine seemed to understand something important. The men standing behind him were no longer entirely on his side. Their flashlights moved slowly across the mural again, taking it in, realizing what they were looking at. "Gentlemen," Kaine said finally, his voice colder now, "we're leaving." Neither miner moved at first. Then the first man stepped forward slowly. "Sir," he said carefully, "we can't just ignore what we found here." Kaine's eyes hardened. "Your employees." The miner shook his head. "Not for this." The chamber fell silent again. Water dripped softly somewhere in the distance. Ranger shifted his weight. Then he stepped aside, just enough to open the narrow passage. Kaine noticed. He looked at the dog. For a moment, something passed through his expression. Frustration, calculation, defeat. He turned back to me. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "It doesn't need to be," I replied. The businessman said nothing more. He walked toward the passage and disappeared into the tunnel. The two miners hesitated. Then one of them stepped closer to me.
"Your grandfather," he said softly, nodding toward the mural. He knew exactly what he was protecting. I nodded. Yes. The miner lifted his flashlight once more and recorded the painted valley across the cavern ceiling. "People are going to want to see this." "Good," I said. Ranger limped gently to my side again. Together we watched as the two men followed Kaine out through the narrow passage. Their lights faded slowly down the tunnel. Silence returned. For a long moment, I simply stood there, in the center of the chamber, beneath the painted valley. Ranger sat beside me, his breathing calm again. "You did good, soldier," I said quietly. His tail thumped once against the stone. We made our way slowly back through the tunnel, past the second chamber, past the laboratory where my grandfather had spent so many years studying the mountain. By the time we reached the entrance, night had fallen outside. The storm clouds had cleared. Stars filled the sky above Silver Ridge Valley. The broken chain lay where it had fallen earlier. Rusty links scattered across the stone. I stepped out into the cold mountain air. Ranger followed and lay down beside the entrance, guarding it, just like he always had. Years later, people would travel from across the country to see the cave. Scientists, artists, students. The mineral pigments became the foundation of new research in natural color preservation. The mural inside the third chamber was declared a protected historical treasure, and the mountain remained untouched. The entrance to the cave now held a small bronze plaque. 3 names engraved in simple letters. Harold Walker sealed the cave. Ethan Walker opened it. Ranger showed him where to look. Every morning the sun rose over Silver Ridge Valley the same way it had for centuries. And every morning, an old German shepherd could still be found lying beside the cave entrance, watching the mountain, guarding its story. Because sometimes the greatest treasures in the world aren't meant to be taken. They're meant to be protected, until the right person and the right dog finally finds the courage to open the door. If this story moved you even a little, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop a simple 1 in the comments if you believe loyalty like Ranger's still exists in this world. Or type 0 if you think stories like this remind us how much we still need it. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, tell us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story about courage, loyalty, and the quiet heroes who stand beside us. Because out there, somewhere in the mountains, forests, and small towns of this country, there are still stories waiting to be discovered.